On today's World Insight, China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang addresses the 52nd session of the UN Human Rights Council. What is China's contribution in safeguarding global human rights? And pandemics and climate change are challenges that demand scientific solutions. The European Research Council shows just how important global scientific cooperation is. And here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang addressed the 52nd session of the UN Human Rights Council through video link on Monday. The Human Rights Council, which was created by the United Nations General Assembly, serves as an important platform for promoting and protecting human rights around the world. This year marks 75th year since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 30 years since the adoption of the Vienna Declaration, two milestone documents that continue to guide the work of the Council. Unfortunately, the international human rights cause is currently beset by both natural and man-made crises, which demand more human solidarity. So how to better promote and protect the human rights, and how can China contribute? Let's loop in our panelists. Joseph Gregory Mahoney joining us from Shanghai. He is a professor of politics at East China Normal University in Beijing. Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, human rights is a concept that embraces a lot of different ideas within one. One of the things that the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang emphasized on is development, the right of development for all. Now, Professor Mahoney, tell me more about why is developing country like China emphasizing on this specific aspect of human rights?
Well, we know that human rights and development go hand in hand. If you're poor and hungry, if you don't have adequate health care, if you face water and energy insecurity, if you face threats of violence and economic crises, then how can you speak of human rights in a credible way? It's not simply that China has made incredible progress in advancing human rights, by some estimates, unprecedented progress, by eliminating extreme poverty, by lifting 800 to 900 million out of poverty, by creating a middle-income population exceeding 400 million. It's done so as a developing country, as the most populous and one of the most diverse countries in the world, and done so while facing serious historical and now contemporary headwinds.
Now, Professor Liu, as an economist, I know you are thinking about how to make sure that the poverty alleviation efforts earlier would not be walked back as a result of years of hardship in the global economy. Of course, it includes that of China. So tell me more about your thoughts as an economist.
Well, I think the fundamental rights, as the declaration shows, is the right to life. So the right to life is dependent on food supplies in the first place. So therefore, the adequate supply of food and nutrition is really a rudimental issue that are still posing challenges to many of those countries. But China is doing far better in that regard by promoting the Chinese arable land and promoting productivity through the rural revitalization program. And the other is the health issue. So through the pandemic, and the whole world are really reminded how catastrophe can really land upon everybody without the right preparation to preserve people's health with the right type of medical catering. And then, okay, the poverty issue related with food, but it encompasses more. So China is really made a remarkable achievement in eliminating extreme poverty. And so the issue is that China, holds more than 1/5 of the whole world population. So when China solved the human rights problem and making sound progresses, the world can also, be brought forth.
Right. At the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Secretary General, Professor Mahoney, did mention about climate change and how it is going to impact on the lives of many in the world, and the human rights issue related to that as well. Now, to what extent do you see that the world is working in coordination and also in cooperation to deal with these global challenges, which of course will impact everyone?
Well, unfortunately, what we hear again and again from the United Nations itself, from leaders from international organizations, including the UN, the World Health Organization, is that we're not seeing sufficient cooperation. We're not seeing countries really committed to working together to solve what are definitively existential questions. Now, not everyone will suffer from climate change, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, some will benefit from it. But a great number of people around the world, including a great number of people in China, a great number of people throughout Asia, but also people in the Americas and Europe, will suffer catastrophic losses as a result of climate change. And there's growing scientific evidence to suggest that climate change closely correlates with new disease outbreaks, including possibly the recent pandemic. So without us working together, without clear commitments through time, and not seeing backsliding, say, for example, with the change of an administration in Washington, or a conflict in Ukraine that undermines European resolve to get rid of fossil fuels. Without this type of cooperation and forward resolve, we're going to see a much darker future for a very large number of people around the world.
Professor Liu, China is very determined about the 2030 and 2060 agenda, decarbonization, of course. But to what extent is efforts being made? As we know, there are economic challenges these days that's facing everyone. So how is China balancing these two at the same time, and as a result of that, try to support the human rights cause of everyone in terms of global challenges, this time, of course, climate change?
Yes. China is still moving ahead with the industrialization, urbanization, but aiming at high quality growth. So therefore, we are transmitting more from the labor intensity or resource intensity industrial pattern, now more onto the technology intensity and more of the consolidated growth level. And that is the notion of high quality. And besides that, we need to really harness the right type of balance between ecological preservation versus economic growth, because economic growth may boost the living standard, but it may not really contribute to the quality of life for the Chinese people. So therefore, this is really something that it requires the right type of governance, and also requires the social awareness with regard to climate change and how that's going to impact on people's future life and the future generations even. So the other is that China is the manufacturing hub for the whole world. And so we are making a lot more shoes and garments and machineries for any part of the world, particularly in North America and Europe. So therefore, we burn a lot of energy in order to cater to the need of the world. So therefore, China needs also to move on a calculated pace. Instead of falling into the trap of decarbonization and also deindustrialization and dehumanization in that regard.
Oh, that's a lot of huge word that you used. Structural reform certainly is an important component of China's economic development for the years to come. One thing that I do not want to miss here is the Russian-Ukraine crisis. Of course, that has becoming a flashpoint for many of those discussants at the Human Rights Council in recent meetings. So, Professor Mahoney, how do you see the issue of human rights, and how do you see different countries try to express their different perspectives looking at the human rights aspect of a Russian-Ukraine conflict?
Well, I think that there have been tremendous shortcomings on both sides of that conflict, not only in terms of human rights atrocities, but also shortcomings in terms of their understanding of their own roles in those conflicts, and likewise how they have understood how either side has or how both sides have suffered. We can say this about Russia, but also Ukraine, but also the United States and NATO, which are arguably fighting a proxy war there and contributing to more death and destruction, as opposed to being much more aggressive in terms of seeking peace. Now, this is clearly a concern. It's something that has had tremendous spillover effects globally in terms of cost push inflation and with regard to energy and wheat and fertilizer prices, which has, of course, disproportionately affected the developing world and above all the global south and countries on the cusp in Africa, especially, but likewise the Americas and some parts of Asia. So this is a global challenge. But I think we tend to be a little too myopic when we hear this being discussed from certain corners. We don't tend to hear, I think, as China has really tried to emphasize with the recent white paper on the Global Security Initiative, of the connection between development and peace, as well as the indivisibility of security.
Of course, China also recently put out the proposal for the political settlement of the Russian-Ukraine conflict last week. Professor Liu, when you see as an economist the politicization of the human rights issue, as the Chinese foreign minister put it in his speech delivered to the council, how do you see the prospect of differences likely to be resolved?
Well, conceptually, I think there is a high consensus over the keywords like, the fundamental rights to freedom, to life, to liberty, to dignity, etc. But some people just use it, as the Human Rights Council officer has put it, use it as a wrecking ball. And there are different interpretations with regard to immediate or self-interest versus the global and long-term interest. So therefore, the different understanding, different interpretation, and also different motivation behind this are really causing conflicts and confrontation and even wars like what is going on in Ukraine and also many other parts of the world. So therefore, a consensus is the basis, but in the meantime, the right type of interpretation and the level of enforcement on the right type of justice and peace is something that is still require a lot more homework and a lot of collective efforts.
Professor Mahoney, earlier we mentioned already in our leading part the two important international documents that almost everyone signed upon for the human rights issues around the world. Now, yet in reality, it's becoming such a dividing issue at times. How to make sure that it will be, on the one hand, addressing the universal human rights that every one of us has as a human being. On the other hand, looking at the arguments of national conditions and also national circumstances. How do you see these two can be reconciled?
Well, generally, for example, we can say that China has a more socialistic view of human rights, where there's an effort to balance individual and collective rights, but skewing in the direction of the latter. In contrast, as a counterexample, the U.S. skews in the direction of the former. Now, on the one hand, we can say that China emphasizes unity at home, but democracy in international relations, while the U.S. has a tendency of doing the opposite. Meanwhile, as we've already noted, China has risen, but the U.S. has declined. And again, by rising, we mean by lifting 800 to 900 million people out of poverty, by creating this leading this world leading middle income group, and along the way ensuring sovereignty and security, that Chinese people rule China and not some foreign power. Now, does this mean that there's necessarily a conflict between these two different visions? I don't think there is. But there is, unfortunately, a conflict between these two countries, a growing conflict that's being instigated by the United States, which is not only provoking anti-China sentiments around the world, it's also contributing to rising anti-Asian American violence in the United States. So I don't think that there's a fundamental gap that can't be bridged, but presently the tendency is to move apart.
We are running out of time for this discussion. Joseph Gregory Mahoney and Liu Baocheng, gentlemen, thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up in the program, pandemic and climate change are challenges that demand scientific solutions. The European Research Council shows just how important global scientific cooperation is.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The world is having little choice but to learn to live with COVID. The global scientific community buckles down to research for solutions to save lives or simply make our lives better. Europe has realized the value of well-funded critical research, which the European Research Council manages. On research priorities, I talked to Maria Leptin, the president of the European Research Council, at the recent World Economic Forum in Davos. She talked about how essential global scientific cooperation is. That's despite the harsh realities of economic fragmentation and cutthroat competition. Here's the interview. Tell me more about when the world is changing so fast, how are you adjusting your plan for research, especially basic research?
So, of course, we don't adjust our plan. Because the plan
I like that answer.
The plan is that the scientists who we fund, they decide what they do. It's really entirely bottom up. And so we make we give no programs, we set no priorities. But we trust the scientists who apply to us to know what is the most important topic to work on. And when they get the funding, they're free to use it in whatever way they deem most appropriate. I mean, they make a proposal, but of course they have to be flexible. And we've seen that works. So 2 of the COVID vaccines were developed by researchers who'd previously been funded by the ERC.
Are you proud of that?
We're very proud of that. We're also proud of the Nobel Prize winners who were previously funded by the ERC. So we think that works best. The scientists know best, so give them the money and the freedom, give the best ones of them the money and the freedom to do what they think is right.
But that's not easy. Here comes the governance, right? You're doing this job. So how would you make sure when you have different pressures coming from all sides saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that?
So of course we're quite young. We're 15 years old. We celebrated, well now 16. So we're coming of age, as it were. And it was not clear that the experiment that the European Union set up 16, 17 years ago would work. It did work. Why does it work? The reason it works is probably because of the very tough selection. So the ERC relies on selection panels made up of international experts from all over the world whose remit it is simply to determine which are the best proposals. So that works, and we're not going to change that. Now, of course, there are things, we have a scientific council that sets the strategy. Of course, the scientific council doesn't sit there and twiddle their thumbs. They think deeply about what's needed. So we think about research assessment. We think about which cohort of candidates should be, how the distribution of the funds should be made. Should there be collaborative projects or not? What should we do with international collaboration? So we do decide on those things, but really the core is the selection for excellence.
I love that. But on the other hand, you see the world's changing. It is a reality.
Yes.
And people are talking about the problems of economic fragmentation,
Yes.
of society fragmentation, and people are also worried about so-called science fragmentation.
Yes.
How do you see, on the one hand, there's a danger of fragmentation. On the other hand, it could be good to have some competition.
Research is competitive. Frontier research is competitive. If you're at the frontier of something, you want to be first to enter new territory. If you discover something that someone else has discovered before, it's no longer discovery. So there is competition in science, and it's good because it keeps us on our toes, it gets us excited. People are competitive by nature. Children are competitive. So we rely on that. Scientists also know that, while they're fighting to be first, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and often fighting together is better. So that's where collaboration comes in. And, but I think there's a lot of sort of self-regulation among scientists.
Tell me more about that.
Well, in the sense that somebody who only exploits, who does not respect others, who steals knowledge, will be cut off from the sources of knowledge. So there's a culture of interaction. Differs in different fields, but there's some self-regulation. In my experience, I've had 40 years of experience in research. That works. And so, of course, we do demand that the researchers we fund abide by ethical principles, absolutely, open science, sharing of data. So that's what we do.
Do you see it getting ever more complicated as a result of many realities?
Well, yes, things are getting more complicated as we advance research.
There's geopolitics, there is the economic recession about the funding, they could all be problematic in the future.
We will have to convince politicians, but all of us have to do that, to recognize the value of fundamental science. And of course, there's so many examples that show that value. The last was, of course, COVID. And as I've already mentioned, there's a clear illustration that the fundamental research is needed for society to adapt to new problems.
From a scientist's perspective, we see the quote-unquote ultimate authority, quote-unquote, ultimate authority of science has been challenged over the past few years. Some are misinformation and fake news against the science. Others are showing that there are limits about what we know about the world.
Yes. I think the fake news problem is not specific to science, as we know. It's we've seen it everywhere. We've seen it about elections. We've seen it everywhere. So I don't think we need to address that. What has been a problem is that scientists who were asked at the beginning of the pandemic, and I don't want to be them, they had a really hard time.
And they are continuing to have a hard time right now.
Yes, it's partly because we as scientists know that when we say we know something, it means we know it now. And when we say this, it's to the best of our knowledge, with a certain degree of uncertainty. And that's hard to understand for people who haven't been trained in science. And if, one scientist says A today, and the next one says 2 weeks later, well, but B, how can they trust them? what needs to be understood is that that is part of science. You know, we do it to the best of our knowledge. We can never be 100% certain. So I think that aspect was missed.
Do you see there is something called the relative truth, quote unquote? There are a lot of people talking about that, so-called relative science, or relative truth.
It's semantic. It's semantic. You know, the scientific method is something that I deeply believe in.
Yeah.
It's something that works. It's something that defines the way we argue. You test, you have a hypothesis, you test it, and you look at the evidence. And that's different from belief. That's evidence-based thinking.
Madam President, another question about international cooperation.
Yes.
I know ERC has been having 15 years great tradition of working with your partners around the world. How would you choose your priorities in terms of international cooperation? Once again, I have to mention about the reality is getting ever more complicated as a result of current affairs. So how do you make sure that scientists can still have the space to be able to work together?
Yeah, well, I think cooperation is essential for research. You know, there is no national science. We exchange knowledge. We have to exchange knowledge. All cooperation has to depend to some degree on trust. Like I said to you before, scientists with each other. You know, we trust some of our colleagues. Right. We don't trust others so much. And I think with global cooperation, that's the same.
How is the trust being built?
By
Because
openness on both sides and by nobody cheating, by nobody stealing. That's how, you know, trust between nations is built in the same way as trust.
Do you see sometimes it's also a communication issue, the rhetorics that we are seeing in our world today?
Of course, different nations, different cultures. But we all know the world, the earth is finite. We know each other quite well. And so I think we understand each other's cultures.
To a certain extent.
To a certain extent. And I think that does enter the equation.
We are seeing over the past few years, Europe on its way to see more of its own identity. So how do you see your role as the head of the European Research Council going with that trend at this moment?
Well, I think what Europe declared a long time ago, 20 years ago, that it wanted to establish the European research area and that countries should you know, increase their funding to at least 3%, hasn't happened. So I tried to tell Europe, you must do that. You know, China puts more funding into research than Europe does. US puts more in. So if Europe thinks they want to lead, then they'd better ramp up. So I see my role as reminding Europe, both at the European level and at the various national levels, that that's important. If we want to have an identity in research, we must invest.
Maria Leptin, President of the European Research Council, and that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.